Okay, so we are talking about goals and objectives. This is a very brief version of writing goals and objectives. I'll give you a very short background. You will get into this in many other classes. So just take this as your first exposure. Um, okay, so when we look at goals and objectives, we want to look at goal areas. That's where I always start. So is it, what is the goal area that we want to um, look at improving for that student? But before we even decide on the goal area, we need to look at the data. The data is the most important part of this process. And so we'll find that data in a few places. The first way we can look at it is all students are evaluated if they qualify for special education services every 3 years. So they receive a triennial evaluation. This should be cognitive, this should be achievement testing, this should also be some rating scales, classroom observation, a file review. So based on that data, as well as other classroom data points, we will be able to establish what areas a student is not age appropriate. That will be found on the present levels of performance page in the IEP. So you'll look on that page as well as in all of the data that you have as a special ed teacher and their formal evaluations every 3 years. When a student first qualifies, those evaluations are what determines how the student qualifies, meaning what area, what disability category, and those evaluations will also determine what goals and objectives the student requires, because the question on the table is, does the student require specialized instruction? What areas are they not age appropriate and would require specialized instruction? This means they need targeted specialized instruction that's not going to catch them up really quick. This will take a little while. So this is different than SRBI. We want to look at the progress on these goals and objectives as well. So these goals and objectives are then measured by very similar data, classroom data, special ed teacher data, based exactly on those goals and objectives. We will be evaluating that, and there's a slide in this presentation showing you the different choices we have for evaluation. We evaluate goals and objectives about 3 to 4 times a year, depending on your school district's policy. A few pieces of information. So if we're looking at data from our formal triennial evaluation, some of the data might come from an assessment called the Wyatt, the Woodcock-Johnson, the Key Math, the TOWEL, the test of written language. There's a bunch of assessments. So there's just a few. You'll take an assessment class and that'll be all explained in that class. So it's one place we'll get data. The other place is more of those formal and informal data points. So many of you have heard of that use STAR Math in your school. So STAR Math, iReady, Writing Records, Fact Fluency, writing samples that are based on a district-wide rubric, teachers' college reading levels, whatever it may be. So those are all other data pieces that will be included in that present levels as well. So those are very important pieces that we need to look at. Those places where we find deficits is where we're going to focus our efforts with goals and objectives. Many times we hear a lot about standard-based goals and objectives. I don't get wrapped up in that because if we're providing good instruction, most of our goals and objectives will be based on the standards regardless. I don't find the need to go back and find a standard and then rewrite it to meet my students' needs. Many of you are immersed in instruction deeply that you won't need to go through that process. So I'm not going to get us stuck there right now. There is a new IEP coming out, which may force our hand a little more to reference what standard we are working on, but that's not the case at the moment. And the new IEP is coming out in about a year from now. Again, my question is, what goal area do they need specialized instruction? So if we write our goals and objectives well enough and we focus our IEP, we should always be looking towards exiting, right? We always want a student to close that gap and be able to be successful without specialized instruction, without a special ed teacher. So we want to make our goals and objectives very measurable so we can show that progress over time. Okay, so generally speaking, our areas that we will have goals and objectives in would be reading, writing, math, behavior, study skills, OT, PT, speech, and other related service areas like that. Transition, which would include independent living skills, post-secondary education, and employment, and as well as functional skills for independence. So this may be some of our, littler guys who may be working on toileting skills, our more impaired students who are working on similar kinds of self-help skills. So, one of my next slides that you're going to see states all of our goals and objectives. And again, I'm going to leave goals off a little bit because they're very broad statements and the work really should be done in the objective area. So all of our objectives need to be skills or behaviors that are measurable. So they can't be general statements or objectives. They need to be skills that are measurable. So our goal statements can be broad. So here's a for example. I went old school. Okay. So you only need to see the top right now. So my goal statement is Ashley will improve her phonological awareness skills as evidenced by the following objectives. Okay. So this is very broad. This is essentially just saying she's going to improve her phonological awareness. The reason I can make it this broad is because I'm using my evaluation criteria. So before this video, there is a link to the IEP. If you look at a goal and objective page, at the bottom, there are evaluation procedures and performance criteria. Those are areas you're going to pick that's going to allow you to determine how you're measuring that goal or objective area. So in this case, I'm going to use the achievement objectives. I'm going to use mastery, which is 100%. So if I do all of the below objectives, I only wrote two of them. If I do all of the below objectives, then I will have mastered the goal. It's the easiest way to write goals and objectives is to use always for your goal statement, achievement of objective, performance criteria mastery, and the trials or percentage being 100% or 3 out of 3 or 4 out of 4, whatever way you want to write it. Okay. So that's our goal statement. Very, very broad. I think of it as an umbrella. Now I'm going to look at all of the different steps it's going to take me to achieve that. So, high tech here. My first objective is Ashley will isolate the first syllable from a 3-syllable word. An example of that would be wonderful. One is my isolation of that syllable, okay? Again, I need to use an evaluation procedure. This is going to be her work sample or job performance. So when she isolates it, she says what that is, whether she says it or she writes it, right? I'm going to be able to evaluate that. I'm also going to use criterion assessments because there are assessments that will evaluate this and give me word lists so I can assess her skills on that. You can put 2 evaluation procedures and 2 performance criteria. The next thing is performance criteria. Is I am going to say if she successfully completes this activity, the isolation, with 90% of the time, then she has met that objective. Okay? I'm going to use the same exact performance criteria and evaluation procedure for the next objective. My next objective, another example of a good objective, would be Ashley will isolate and verbally identify the first sound and initial blend on on 1-syllable words. Example, grow, go. Okay? So I'm using the same exact evaluation criteria. Okay? So I will just repeat that process for the remainder of my objectives that I find necessary for her to meet that goal. Traditionally, goals and objectives, there's one goal with, I would say a goal is not necessary if you can't write more than 2 objectives. And I'd say a good rule of thumb is 3 to 4 objectives. 5, 6 gets a little bit high. Okay, there's no rule on what's the minimum or maximum, but I just like those numbers. I think they work well. Okay, so the next piece is looking at here's one example of a goal that I have found written. and it's too much. I'll show you why. With 90%, this is an objective. With 90% accuracy, James will write a paragraph showing understanding of the author's craft by June 2019. Here are the reasons why it's too much. I don't need with 90% accuracy because remember my performance criteria, my evaluation criteria is going to explain that, right? Remember where I had 100% on the goal and 90% on the objective? That's right there. I don't need to write it inside of my objective. Here's the next piece. By June 2019, it doesn't matter when the end of this is because each IEP is a natural end date. So if I master something early, great. I would write mastery on my progress notes and make sure if there's all the objectives to meet that goal have been mastered, I'd go back to PPT and probably propose a new goal. So you do not need that. It just makes the objective way too wordy. Here's my next problem with this objective. Showing understanding, right? So if I'm showing understanding, what does that look like? What am I doing? I don't know. Okay, so we want to make sure we're really specific. In this PowerPoint, under verbs, there's a link to a document that gives you really wonderful verbs to use when writing goals and objectives. At the top of the document, please make note, there are a few verbs that are suggested you do not use. One of them is understanding. You can't measure understanding. Here's a better version. James will write a paragraph explaining the author's craft and cite one piece of evidence from the text to support his thinking. Therefore, I can measure this because he is going to explain the author's craft, right? Tell me what the author's craft is, and then cite one piece of evidence. If he does those two things in his paragraph and they connect and they support his thinking, he has done this as expected, right? I can see that happen. I can take his paragraph, I can check off these two items in his paragraph. Versus understanding is way too broad. I know he understands it when he can explain it and cite one piece of evidence that supports his explanation. All right. I'm going to stop here, and what I'm going to have you do is look at the next slide, which asks you now to go through and evaluate some goals and objectives.